The fragments of our modern world scatter like broken glass across the pavement of consciousness, each piece reflecting distorted light, seemingly without pattern or purpose. Yet what if I told you that this very fragmentation, this apparent chaos, could become the foundation for a new kind of literary art? That the broken images of contemporary life might be assembled into something more profound than the neat certainties of the past. When I began writing in the early decades of this century, literature faced a crisis. The old forms, the comfortable rhythms, the assured moral frameworks, all seemed inadequate to capture the reality of existence after Industrial Revolution, World War, and the collapse of traditional authority. We needed a new language, a new method. What emerged was not destruction but transformation. Today, as you navigate your own fragmented digital landscape, the principles we discovered then have never been more relevant. The revolution we began continues to shape how stories are told, how consciousness is explored, how meaning emerges from seeming meaninglessness. Chapter 1: Breaking the Victorian Mold. When I arrived at Harvard, then later in London, the literary world was still largely trapped within Victorian constraints. Poetry meant regular meter, predictable rhyme schemes, and moral instruction delivered with the certainty of a Sunday sermon. Novels followed prescribed patterns of beginning, middle, and triumphant resolution. The assumption was that art should comfort, console, and confirm existing beliefs about progress and human perfectibility. But the 20th century demanded honesty about its own fragmented nature. Standing in London after the Great War, watching the crowds flow over London Bridge, I knew that the old certainties had crumbled. How could poetry continue to speak in the measured cadences of Tennyson when consciousness itself had become a jagged montage of sensations, memories, and half-formed thoughts? The breakthrough came with understanding that literature need not impose artificial order upon chaos. Instead, it could discover authentic patterns within apparent disorder. In The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I allowed the speaker's mind to move associatively, from evening sky to patient etherized upon a table, from social anxiety to cosmic questions, from yellow fog to mermaids singing. This wasn't randomness but a truer mapping of how consciousness actually operates. The technique freed poetry from the tyranny of logical sequence. No longer did every line need to follow inevitably from the previous one. Instead, images could be juxtaposed to create what I termed objective correlatives, external situations that embody particular emotions without explicitly naming them. The fog in Prufrock becomes the perfect correlative for indecision and spiritual paralysis without ever stating these themes directly. This approach revolutionized how literature could access the inner life. Instead of telling readers what characters felt, we could create the very texture of feeling through rhythm, image, and association. The mind's actual movements, its sudden leaps, its buried connections, its half-conscious recognitions, became the structural principle of the work itself. The implications extended far beyond technique. By acknowledging fragmentation as a fundamental condition rather than a problem to be solved, literature gained new powers of truthfulness. American writers especially would build upon this foundation, creating works that honored both the diversity and the underlying unity of their vast continental experience. Chapter 2: The Wasteland Revolution. The wasteland represented something unprecedented in English literature, a long poem that refused to tell a coherent story or develop a single argument, yet somehow achieved profound unity through the orchestration of fragments. When it appeared in 1922, readers were bewildered, critics were divided, but the work's influence began spreading immediately through the literary consciousness of the age. The poem's revolutionary technique lay in its method of composition from cultural fragments. Ancient fertility myths, contemporary London scenes, Sanskrit wisdom, music hall songs, Shakespearean allusions, and overheard conversations were woven together without traditional transitions or explanatory passages. Each section seemed to emerge from the unconscious of the century itself, as if the poem were dreaming the collective trauma of modern civilization. This fragmentary method reflected a crucial insight about 20th century experience. Reality itself had become fragmented. Traditional communities had dissolved, religious certainties had evaporated, and individuals found themselves isolated in urban landscapes that offered no meaningful connection to nature, history, or transcendent purpose. A poem attempting to capture this reality needed to embody its very structure. Yet, The Wasteland was not an expression of despair but a diagnostic tool. By collecting the fragments of cultural memory, from the Grail legend to Eastern philosophy, the poem suggested that renewal remained possible. The final Sanskrit incantations, dada, diadvam, damayata, give, sympathize, control, offered a path through the wasteland toward spiritual regeneration. The work's impact on subsequent literature was immeasurable. It demonstrated that modernist techniques were not merely experimental games but necessary responses to genuine cultural conditions. Writers around the world recognized that their own literary traditions might require similar renovation to remain relevant to contemporary experience. American literature particularly benefited from this liberation. Writers like Hart Crane, William Carlos Williams, and later poets learned that they could draw simultaneously from European cultural heritage and distinctly American experiences without sacrificing artistic integrity. The fragmentary method allowed for the inclusion of multiple voices, varied social levels, and diverse regional perspectives within single works. The poem also established the principle that difficulty in literature need not be mere obscurity. When cultural reference points have become unstable, art must work harder to create meaning. Readers willing to engage with challenging works would be rewarded with deeper insights than surface clarity could provide. This raised the stakes for both writers and readers, creating a more demanding but ultimately more rewarding literary culture. Chapter 3: Tradition and the Individual Talent. Perhaps my most influential critical insight concerned the relationship between tradition and innovation in artistic creation. In my essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, I argued that truly original work emerges not from rejection of the past but from deep engagement with the entire historical order of literature. This concept revolutionized how writers understood their own creative process and their relationship to literary history. The common assumption was that originality meant breaking free from influence, finding one's unique voice by rejecting predecessors. This romantic notion led to literature that was often merely personal, lacking the resonance that comes from connection to larger cultural continuities. True originality, I discovered, required what I called historical sense, an awareness of the timeless and temporal elements in literature, and of one's place within the ongoing conversation of literary consciousness. When a genuinely new work of art appears, it does not simply add to the existing collection of literature. Instead, it alters the relationships among all existing works, creating new patterns of meaning and significance. The order of literature is complete before the new work arrives, but never static. Each authentic edition reorganizes the whole, causing us to see earlier works in fresh ways while establishing its own place within the continuously evolving tradition. This principle liberated American writers from cultural anxiety about their relationship to European literary heritage. Rather than viewing that heritage as a burden or constraint, they could engage with it as living material for contemporary creation. The goal was not to imitate but to extend, to add new elements that would enrich the tradition while serving present needs. The concept also addressed the problem of personality in art. Poetry, I argued, should not be an expression of personality but an escape from personality. The artist's individual emotions and experiences provide raw material, but the work of art must transform these personal elements into something impersonal and universal. The poet's mind becomes a catalyst, enabling chemical reactions between disparate elements that create new compounds of meaning. This impersonal theory of poetry profoundly influenced how subsequent writers approached their craft. Instead of mining their personal lives for material, they learned to observe, select, and combine elements from the entire range of human experience. The result was literature that spoke to universal conditions while maintaining individual artistic vision. The practical implications were enormous. Writers could draw freely from multiple cultural traditions, incorporate various literary forms and techniques, and address contemporary concerns while maintaining connection to timeless themes. This approach proved especially valuable for American literature, which had always been characterized by cultural mixing and creative adaptation of diverse influences. Chapter 4: The Objective Correlative Method. One of my most practical contributions to literary technique was the concept of the objective correlative, a method for expressing emotion in art without resorting to direct statement or sentimental effusion. This principle transformed how writers approached the fundamental challenge of making readers feel what cannot be adequately expressed through mere description or explanation. The objective correlative consists of a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts, which must terminate in sensory experience, are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. Rather than telling readers that a character feels despair, the writer presents concrete circumstances that inevitably produce that emotional response in any sensitive observer. Consider how this works in practice. In The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I never state that the protagonist suffers from social anxiety and spiritual paralysis. Instead, I present the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the tedious argument of insidious intent that leads through half-deserted streets, and the terrible question, do I dare to eat a peach? These concrete images and situations contain the emotion so completely that readers experience Prufrock's condition directly rather than merely understanding it intellectually. The technique revolutionized both poetry and prose by solving the age-old problem of sentimentality in literature. When emotions are stated directly, I am sad, she was angry, we felt joy, the result often feels hollow because readers have no authentic basis for sharing those feelings. But when the external conditions that produce emotions are presented with sufficient precision and completeness, readers experience the emotions as their own discoveries rather than imposed interpretations. This method proved especially valuable for American writers dealing with the complexity of modern urban experience. The traditional vocabulary of emotion seemed inadequate to capture the subtleties of consciousness in an industrial, multicultural society. The objective correlative provided a way to express new forms of feeling without resorting to abstract terminology or psychological jargon. The technique also addressed the problem of cultural communication across different backgrounds and experiences. By grounding emotion in concrete, observable circumstances, writers could bridge gaps between diverse readers. A carefully chosen objective correlative could evoke similar responses in people from different social classes, ethnic backgrounds, or regional cultures, creating genuine artistic community despite surface differences. Modern American literature from Hemingway to contemporary writers continues to employ this principle. The technique appears in film, where visual correlatives carry emotional weight without dialogue, and in digital media, where images and situations must quickly establish emotional contexts. The method's continued relevance demonstrates how fundamental technical innovations can transcend their original historical moment to become permanent expansions of artistic possibility. Chapter 5: For Quartets and Spiritual Integration. My later work, particularly For Quartets, demonstrated how the fragmentation techniques of early modernism could evolve toward integration and spiritual synthesis. These poems represent the maturation of experimental methods into instruments capable of exploring the deepest questions of existence, time, and transcendence. They show how literary innovation can serve not only aesthetic purposes but also spiritual investigation. Each quartet explores different aspects of time and eternity through specific geographical locations: Burnt Norton, East Coker, the Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding. But the real innovation lay in the musical structure, where themes are introduced, developed, varied, and resolved across complex patterns of repetition and transformation. This allowed for exploration of philosophical concepts that resist linear argument or logical progression. The opening of Burnt Norton, time present and time past / are both perhaps present in time future / and time future contained in time past, establishes a meditation on temporal paradox that unfolds through image, rhythm, and recursive musical development rather than systematic exposition. The reader experiences insights about the nature of time rather than merely comprehending arguments about it. This approach proved revolutionary for spiritual literature in particular. Traditional religious poetry had often relied on received doctrine, conventional imagery, or emotional exhortation. The quartets demonstrated how modernist techniques could create fresh access to mystical experience, making ancient spiritual truths available to contemporary consciousness without sacrificing intellectual rigor or artistic sophistication. The integration of personal and universal elements in these poems also offered a model for mature artistic development. Earlier modernist works had often emphasized fragmentation, discontinuity, and cultural breakdown. The quartets showed how these techniques could be employed in service of synthesis, revealing underlying unity within apparent diversity and discovering eternal dimensions within temporal experience. American spiritual literature would draw extensively from this example. Writers could address religious questions without falling into either fundamentalist literalism or vague romanticism. The precise exploration of spiritual states through concrete imagery and musical structure provided a middle way between dogmatic assertion and skeptical doubt. The poems also demonstrated how local, specific experiences could open onto universal spiritual dimensions. Each quartet is rooted in particular English landscapes and historical moments, yet the discoveries made through engagement with these specifics prove relevant to spiritual seekers everywhere. This principle would prove especially valuable for American writers dealing with their own diverse regional and cultural landscapes. The technical achievement of sustaining philosophical meditation through purely poetic means, without resort to prose explanation or abstract argumentation, established new possibilities for literature as a form of knowledge. Poetry could investigate questions traditionally reserved for philosophy or theology, but through its own distinctive methods of rhythm, image, and musical development. Chapter 6: Cultural Criticism and Modern Diagnosis. My critical essays, particularly notes towards the definition of culture, provided diagnostic tools for understanding the spiritual and intellectual challenges facing modern democratic societies. These works demonstrated how literary insight could illuminate broader cultural questions, offering perspective on issues that remain central to American and global civilization today. The fundamental problem I identified was the fragmentation of culture itself. In traditional societies, cultural transmission occurred through integrated communities where artistic, religious, educational, and social elements reinforced each other. Modern democracy, while offering political freedoms, often produces cultural atomization where individuals lose connection to coherent traditions of meaning and value. This diagnosis proved prophetic for American culture. The very diversity and mobility that constitute America's strengths also create challenges for cultural continuity. Without inherited class structures or established churches providing cultural coherence, American society must consciously cultivate the conditions for cultural transmission across generations and diverse populations. My analysis suggested that culture cannot be manufactured through institutional programs or governmental initiatives. Instead, it emerges from the interaction between conscious tradition and unconscious inheritance, between elite artistic achievement and popular cultural participation. The health of a culture depends on maintaining productive tension between innovation and conservation, individual expression and communal values. The role of literature in this cultural ecology is crucial but complex. Authentic literary works cannot be produced to serve predetermined cultural functions, yet the vitality of literary culture profoundly affects the spiritual health of society as a whole. Writers must maintain artistic integrity while remaining conscious of their responsibility to the larger cultural conversation. This perspective influenced American approaches to arts education, cultural policy, and public intellectual discourse. The recognition that culture requires both popular participation and elite excellence helped justify public support for the arts while acknowledging that such support cannot directly control or determine artistic creation. My emphasis on the international dimension of culture also proved prescient. Healthy cultures, I argued, must be both rooted in particular traditions and open to cross-cultural exchange. American culture, with its unique position between European inheritance and global innovation, exemplifies both the opportunities and challenges of maintaining cultural coherence in an internationally connected world. The critical framework I developed continues to illuminate contemporary cultural debates. Questions about multiculturalism, educational curricula, digital media's impact on cultural transmission, and the relationship between popular and elite culture all benefit from the analytical tools I helped establish. Perhaps most importantly, my cultural criticism insisted that intellectual and spiritual questions cannot be separated from practical social arrangements. The quality of a society's literature, philosophy, and religious life both reflects and influences its political and economic institutions. Cultural health is not a luxury but a necessity for sustainable democratic civilization. Chapter 7: The Continuing Revolution. The literary revolution we initiated continues to unfold in ways that both fulfill and extend our original insights. Contemporary American writers, digital media creators, and global literary voices employ techniques we pioneered while addressing cultural conditions we could barely imagine. Yet the fundamental principles remain remarkably relevant to current artistic and cultural challenges. The fragmentary method that seemed radical in The Waste Land now appears prophetic of digital culture, where information arrives in disconnected pieces requiring active synthesis by individual consciousness. Social media, web browsing, and multimedia storytelling all employ juxtaposition techniques that modernist poetry first developed. The difference is that we used fragmentation consciously, as an artistic method for discovering underlying unity, while digital fragmentation often remains unconscious and scattered. This creates both opportunity and responsibility for contemporary artists. The tools for assembling fragments into meaningful patterns are more sophisticated than ever, but the need for conscious artistic intention has become even more urgent. Writers who understand the principles behind modernist innovation can help navigate information overload toward authentic insight and genuine cultural contribution. The objective correlative method has found new applications in visual media, where filmmakers and digital artists create emotional experiences through careful orchestration of images, sounds, and narrative situations rather than explicit emotional declaration. The principle that showed emotion through external circumstances rather than internal description proves even more valuable when working with audiences accustomed to sophisticated media literacy. American literature's relationship to global culture continues to evolve along lines we established. The principle that authentic originality emerges from deep engagement with tradition, rather than rejection of influence, helps contemporary writers navigate the complexity of multicultural heritage and international literary conversation. Writers can draw from diverse traditions while maintaining artistic integrity and cultural authenticity. The impersonal theory of poetry proves especially relevant in an age of social media self-expression and confessional culture. The discipline of transforming personal experience into artistic work that speaks to universal conditions provides a necessary alternative to mere self-promotion or therapeutic expression. Art remains distinct from autobiography, requiring craft, conscious technique, and engagement with larger cultural conversations. Perhaps most significantly, the integration we achieved in For Quartets suggests possibilities for moving beyond the fragmentation phase of modernist innovation toward new forms of synthesis. Contemporary writers can employ experimental techniques not merely to express cultural breakdown but to discover authentic sources of meaning and spiritual renewal within current conditions. The challenge for emerging writers is to understand these techniques not as historical artifacts but as living tools for addressing present cultural needs. The revolution we began was not about destroying traditional forms but about expanding the range of authentic artistic expression. Each generation must discover how to apply these expanded possibilities to their own historical moment and cultural circumstances. Conclusion. The literary revolution we initiated was never intended as an end in itself but as a means of restoring authentic connection between artistic expression and lived experience. In fragmenting old forms, we sought not destruction but renovation, new ways of discovering and communicating the eternal patterns that give meaning to temporal existence. Today, as you navigate your own fragmented digital landscape, the principles we established remain essential tools for cultural creativity and spiritual development. The objective correlative helps you express what cannot be directly stated. The tradition of individual talent provides a framework for authentic originality. The integration of fragments reveals underlying unity within apparent chaos. Literature changed because consciousness changed, and consciousness continues evolving. Your task as readers, writers, and cultural participants is to continue the work we began, discovering how the expanding possibilities of artistic expression can serve the enduring human need for meaning, beauty, and transcendent purpose. The revolution continues not through imitation of our specific techniques but through application of our essential discovery, that broken forms can be reassembled into new wholeness. That authentic tradition includes conscious innovation, and that the fragments of modern experience, carefully attended, reveal patterns of significance that connect temporal existence to eternal dimensions of truth.